The soft morning light filtered through the curtains as she stood before her bedroom mirror, her fingers moving with practiced care over each button of her crisp pilot's uniform. The four stripes on her sleeve caught the light, reminding her of just how far she'd come. At 34 years old, she was living a dream that once seemed impossible, being one of the few black women commercial airline pilots in the country. Her mind drifted back to that special day 25 years ago, when her grandmother first took her to the airport observation deck. They'd sat there for hours, sharing ham and cheese sandwiches while watching planes take off and land. "Look at them," her grandmother had whispered, eyes twinkling with wisdom. "They're like giant birds, carrying people's dreams across the sky." That day changed everything. While other kids in her neighborhood played house or dreamed of becoming doctors and teachers, she spent countless hours in her backyard, arms spread wide, making airplane noises as she ran circles around her mother's vegetable garden. Her parents didn't have much money, but they had determination. Her father picked up extra shifts at the factory, and her mother started a small catering business from their kitchen, all to save up for their daughter's flying lessons. High school wasn't easy. Her guidance counselor suggested more realistic career options, telling her that people like her didn't usually become pilots. But those words only fueled her fire. She worked weekends at the local diner, studied late into the night, and earned a scholarship to study aviation. Every small victory was a step closer to the sky. Now, as she straightened her collar and checked her appearance one final time, her eyes fell on the small photo tucked into the corner of her mirror. It showed a gap-toothed 7-year-old girl wearing oversized aviator sunglasses, standing proudly next to a cardboard box she turned into a makeshift cockpit. The same passion that burned in that little girl's eyes still flickered in her own. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother wishing her a good flight, just like every morning. "Fly safe, baby. You're making history every time you take off." She smiled, tucking the phone into her pocket. Her uniform carried more than just her airline's logo. It carried the weight of representation, the hopes of little girls looking up at the sky, and the prayers of ancestors who never had the chance to dream this big. She grabbed her flight bag, heavy with manuals and charts, and took one last look around her room. The walls were decorated with her journey, her first solo flight certificate, pictures with her flight instructors, and that precious commercial pilot's license that took years of sweat and tears to earn. Each item told a story of persistence, of pushing through barriers that seemed unmovable. Walking through her living room, she paused to water the small potted plant her grandmother had given her before passing away 2 years ago. "Keep growing," she whispered, both to the plant and herself. That's what her grandmother always said. "Just like these plants, baby, you keep growing no matter what weather comes your way." As she stepped out into the dawn, her pilot's bag slung confidently over her shoulder, neighbors waved from their porches. To them, she wasn't just a pilot. She was living proof that dreams don't have color limits. Children on their way to school would point and whisper, "There goes the pilot lady." Their excitement reminded her daily why representation mattered so much. She climbed into her car, placing her cap carefully on the passenger seat. Today was just another flight in her logbook, but she knew better. Every time she stepped into that cockpit, she was breaking barriers and opening doors. As she pulled out of her driveway, the morning sun caught her wings pin, making it shine like a beacon of hope, not just for her, but for every person who'd ever been told their dreams were too big for their circumstances. The morning bustle at Atlanta International Airport was in full swing as she walked through the sliding glass doors, her pilot's bag rolling smoothly behind her. The familiar smell of coffee and jet fuel filled the air, a scent that always made her heart beat a little faster. She'd been flying for 12 years now, but the excitement of each flight day never faded. Walking through the terminal, she noticed the usual mix of reactions. Some passengers did double takes, others smiled warmly, and a few small children pointed in wonder. A little girl wearing butterfly clips in her hair tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Look, Mommy." She's flying the plane." The mother gave an encouraging smile, and she winked at the little girl, remembering herself at that age. In the crew room, she pulled out her flight plans for the Dallas-bound route. The weather report showed clear skies with some afternoon turbulence expected over Mississippi. As she reviewed the passenger manifest, she could feel the subtle shift in energy when she entered. Some of her colleagues were wonderfully supportive, while others still carried their prejudices just beneath the surface, shown in small ways, like avoiding eye contact or falling silent when she approached. Her first officer arrived, a younger man who'd been flying with her for the past 6 months. Unlike some others, he'd always treated her with respect, eager to learn from her experience. "Morning, Captain," he said, grabbing his own copy of the flight plan. "Ready for another day in the office?" She smiled, appreciating his professional attitude that never wavered because of her gender or color. During the pre-flight check, she moved through the cockpit with practiced precision, her hands dancing over switches and dials she knew better than her own kitchen layout. Each check was a ritual, a dance she performed thousands of times. The maintenance crew chief watched from the doorway, nodding approvingly. He was old school, but he learned to respect her attention to detail, often saying she was one of the most thorough pilots he'd worked with. As she walked through the cabin for her visual inspection, she overheard snippets of conversation from the flight attendants. "Best captain on this route," one whispered to a new hire. "Watch and learn." Those words warmed her heart, remembering the days when she had to work twice as hard just to be considered half as good. Back in the cockpit, she adjusted her seat and began the final preparations. Her grandfather's old pocket watch, safely tucked in her flight bag, showed she was right on schedule. He'd given it to her on her first day of flight school, saying, "Time doesn't care what color or gender you are. It's what you do with it that matters." The ground crew started their final checks outside her window. One of them, an older man who'd been working the ramps for 30 years, gave her his usual salute. He'd once told her how his granddaughter had changed her career plans to aviation after seeing a black woman pilot for the first time. These small moments reminded her why every challenge was worth it. Her first officer returned from his external walk-around, giving a thumbs up. They began their pre-flight checklist, their voices clear and professional over the headsets. This was her favorite part, the quiet before the storm, when the cockpit was her sanctuary and the sky was full of promise. The gate agent knocked on the cockpit door, handing her the final passenger count. "Full flight today, Captain," she said with a warm smile. "They're lucky to have you at the controls." These small gestures of support, built over years of proving herself flight after flight, meant everything. As passengers started boarding, she could hear their footsteps and chatter filling the cabin behind her. She took a deep breath, feeling the familiar mixture of responsibility and pride. In just a few hours, she would guide this massive machine and all its precious cargo safely through the clouds. It wasn't just a job, it was a statement that dreams don't discriminate, and the sky truly is the limit for anyone brave enough to reach for it. The boarding process was going smoothly as she made her routine walk through first class, checking that everything was in order. The familiar sounds of overhead bins clicking shut and passengers settling into their seats filled the cabin. She always made these walks with pride, her uniform pressed and perfect, her captain's wings gleaming under the cabin lights. That's when she heard it, a loud, disapproving voice that cut through the usual airplane murmur. "Excuse me," called out an elderly man in seat 3A, his voice carrying an edge that made nearby passengers look up from their phones and magazines. "I need to speak with the real pilot." The cabin grew quiet, the kind of heavy silence that falls when something uncomfortable is about to unfold. She turned towards the voice, keeping her expression professional and calm, though her heart was beating faster. She'd faced moments like this before, but they never got easier. "I am the captain of this flight, sir," she said clearly, her voice steady and professional. The man's face twisted with disbelief, his gray eyebrows furrowing deeply. "No, no," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "I mean the actual pilot." I've been flying for 40 years, and I've never seen one of you flying a plane before." Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A businesswoman in 4B looked up sharply, her face showing clear disapproval at the man's words. A flight attendant stepped forward, ready to intervene, but the captain gave a subtle shake of her head. She'd handle this herself. "Sir, I've been a commercial pilot for 12 years, she explained, maintaining her composure. "I have over 10,000 flight hours and am fully qualified to command this aircraft." She reached for her credentials, though she knew she shouldn't have to prove herself. The man wasn't finished. "Look," he said, his voice getting louder, "I'm not trying to cause trouble, but I have a right to feel safe. This isn't some kind of social experiment. This is a commercial flight." A few gasps came from nearby passengers. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, watched the scene unfold with wide eyes, clutching her mother's arm. The flight attendant stepped closer again, ready to escort the disruptive passenger off the plane, but the captain raised her hand slightly. Years of experience had taught her that sometimes the best response to ignorance wasn't anger, but education. She could feel all eyes on her. The concerned flight attendants, the watching passengers, the young girl who might be seeing for the first time how the world sometimes treats people who dare to break barriers. This moment wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of commanding aircraft through storms, "I'd be happy to show you my flight credentials and discuss my qualifications. In fact, if you'd like, I can explain our pre-flight safety protocols and the systems we'll be using today." The man blinked, clearly not expecting this response. He'd probably anticipated anger or confrontation, not this calm offer of professional dialogue. Other passengers were watching intently now, some nodding in approval at her handling of the situation. "Perhaps you'd like to step to the front with me for a moment," she continued, gesturing toward the cockpit area. "I can show you our flight plan and explain the weather patterns we'll be navigating today. Safety is my top priority, just as it is yours." Her words hung in the air, professional yet powerful. The man's face showed confusion, then a flicker of something else, perhaps the first crack in his prejudiced armor. Around them, the cabin remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of people witnessing someone choose grace over anger, education over confrontation. A younger passenger nearby quietly said, "I'd feel safest with the most qualified pilot, regardless of what they look like." Several others murmured in agreement, their collective support creating a shield of solidarity around their captain. She stood there, straight and professional, her years of training and experience evident in every inch of her bearing. This wasn't just about one flight or one passenger anymore. It was about showing everyone watching that excellence knows no color, and that true professionalism shines through even the darkest clouds of prejudice. Taking a deep breath, she reached into her flight bag and pulled out her credentials. Years of experience had taught her that moments like these required not just strength, but wisdom. The leather folder containing her licenses and certificates felt heavy in her hands, not from its physical weight, but from the years of hard work, dedication, and barriers overcome that it represented. "These are my qualifications," she said calmly, opening the folder. Inside were her airline transport pilot license, her medical certificates, and documentation of her thousands of flight hours. Each paper told a story of early morning studies, late-night simulator sessions, and countless evaluations where she had to be nothing less than perfect. The elderly passenger's eyes moved across the documents, his expression still skeptical but slightly softening. Around them, other passengers watched the scene unfold. A teenager had stopped scrolling on his phone, completely absorbed by what was happening. Two businessmen exchanged knowing looks, having perhaps witnessed similar scenes of discrimination in their own workplaces. "I graduated at the top of my class from one of the country's leading aviation programs," she continued, her voice steady and clear. I've flown through hurricanes, handled emergency landings, and safely transported over 100,000 passengers throughout my career. She wasn't bragging. These were simply facts, stated with the quiet confidence of someone who knew their worth. A flight attendant stood nearby, ready to support if needed, but understanding this was her moment to handle. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this would unfold. The air felt thick with tension, but she remained as cool as when she navigated through turbulent skies. Every pilot on this airline, she continued, regardless of their gender or color, goes through the same rigorous training. We're all held to the same high standards because safety is our absolute priority. Her words carried the weight of truth and professionalism that no prejudice could diminish. The passenger shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His initial hostility seemed to be warring with the evidence of competence before him. A woman across the aisle spoke up softly. "I fly this route every week for business, and this captain is known for the smoothest landings." She acknowledged the support with a slight nod, but kept her focus on the challenging passenger. "Sir, I understand your concern for safety. It's a concern I share every time I step into that cockpit. Would you like to know about today's flight plan and the weather conditions we're expecting?" Her offer to share professional knowledge rather than react with anger seemed to catch him off guard. His hands, which had been tightly gripping his armrests, slowly relaxed. Other passengers had begun sharing quiet words of support, creating a gentle wave of solidarity throughout the cabin. A young girl, watching wide-eyed from a few rows back, whispered loudly to her mother, "Mom, when I grow up, I want to be brave like her." The words carried clearly in the quiet cabin, and several passengers smiled. This moment was teaching lessons far beyond aviation. The flight attendant who had been standing by finally stepped forward. "Captain, we're ready for the safety briefing whenever you are." The words were simple, but carried respect and support. The crew's confidence in their captain was clear and unwavering. Looking at her watch, she knew it was time to return to the cockpit for final preparations. She closed her credentials folder with practiced care and looked directly at the passenger who had challenged her. "Sir, my first officer and I will be doing our best to give you a safe and comfortable flight today. That's not just my job, it's my calling." As she turned to walk back to the cockpit, she felt dozens of eyes following her. Her steps were steady, her head held high. She had handled the situation not by matching anger with anger, but by letting her professionalism and accomplishments speak for themselves. This wasn't the first time she'd faced such prejudice, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But each time, she chose to respond with dignity and excellence, not just for herself, but for every little girl watching and dreaming of reaching for the stars, regardless of what anyone might say about their chances of touching them. Instead of letting the situation escalate further, she made a decision that surprised everyone. "Sir," she said, turning back to face the skeptical passenger, "would you like to join me in the cockpit for a moment? I'd be happy to show you exactly how we prepare for a safe flight." The offer hung in the air, unexpected and powerful. Other passengers watched in stunned silence. The elderly man's expression shifted from suspicion to surprise, clearly not expecting this response to his challenging behavior. You'd do that?" he asked, his voice losing some of its earlier edge. She nodded, gesturing towards the cockpit. "As long as we maintain our schedule, I have time to show you our pre-flight procedures. Sometimes seeing is believing." As they walked to the front of the plane, she could hear the murmur of conversations starting up behind them. The flight attendant held the cockpit door open, giving her an encouraging smile. Inside, her first officer was already running through the pre-flight checklist. "This is our flight deck," she explained, watching as the passengers' eyes widened at the array of instruments. "Every dial, every switch, every screen has a specific purpose." She began pointing out different controls, explaining their functions in simple terms. "These are our primary flight displays," she continued, her voice taking on the same confident tone she used when training new pilots. "They show our altitude, speed, and orientation. And here's our weather radar system. We're tracking a small patch of turbulence over Mississippi that we'll be avoiding. The passenger listened intently, his earlier hostility melting into genuine interest. She showed him their flight plan, explaining how they choose the safest and most efficient routes. Weather, wind patterns, other air traffic. We consider all these factors before and during every flight. I had no idea it was so complex, he admitted, looking at the sophisticated equipment. She nodded. It takes years of training and experience to master all this. Every pilot here, regardless of what they look like, has earned their place in this seat. She pulled out the maintenance log, showing him the thorough checks required before each flight. Safety isn't just about the pilot. It's about the whole system working together. Our mechanics, our flight attendants, our air traffic controllers, we're all part of keeping you safe. A flight attendant appeared at the door. Captain, we're ready for boarding to continue. The passenger looked embarrassed, suddenly aware of how his earlier behavior must have appeared to others. Before you go back to your seat, she said, pulling out a detailed weather map, let me show you our route today and the specific procedures we'll be using for takeoff. Her voice remained professional and inclusive, treating him like any other curious passenger rather than someone who had doubted her abilities. As she explained the technical aspects of the flight, she could see his perception changing. His questions became more respectful, showing genuine interest rather than skepticism. Other passengers passing by the cockpit door glanced in, many smiling at the scene of education replacing confrontation. You know, he said quietly, my granddaughter wants to be a pilot. I never thought. He trailed off, looking ashamed. She smiled warmly. Tell her the sky's open to everyone who's willing to work hard enough to reach it. Before he returned to his seat, she showed him one final thing. A small photo tucked into her flight bag. It showed her graduating class from flight school, where she'd been the only woman of color. Change happens one flight at a time, she said softly. The passenger walked back to his seat a different person than the one who had challenged her minutes ago. As he sat down, several nearby passengers noticed his changed demeanor. A young woman across the aisle gave him an approving nod. Back in the cockpit, she settled into her seat, feeling a mix of emotions, but mostly hope. Sometimes the best way to break down barriers wasn't to crash through them, but to open a door and invite someone to see the view from the other side. As word of what happened spread through the cabin, something remarkable began to unfold. A middle-aged woman in row 7 stood up and caught the flight attendant's attention. Could you tell the captain something for me? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I've been a teacher for 25 years, and I've faced similar things. She handled that situation better than anything I've seen. The supportive atmosphere continued to grow. A businessman from row 12 shared his own story with his seatmate about how his daughter, the only female engineer in her company, dealt with daily doubts about her abilities. Watching our captain just now, he said, wiping his eyes, reminded me of how proud I am of my little girl. Near the back of the plane, a young black girl, around 10 years old, sat with her face pressed against the window, clutching a worn notebook filled with drawings of airplanes. Her mother gently touched her shoulder and whispered, "See, I told you it was possible." The girl's eyes sparkled with newfound determination. A flight attendant overheard their conversation and approached them with a warm smile. "Would you like me to see if the captain has a minute to speak with your daughter after we land?" she offered. The girl's face lit up like a sunrise, while her mother fought back tears of gratitude. An elderly woman across the aisle joined their conversation. "When I was young," she said, leaning in close, "they told me I couldn't be a doctor because I was a woman. I did it anyway. Took me 10 years longer than everyone else, but I did it." Watching our captain today brought back all those memories. The original passenger who had caused the scene sat quietly, listening to these stories flowing around him. His face showed a mix of emotions. Embarrassment at his earlier behavior, but also understanding as he heard story after story of barriers broken and dreams achieved. A college student a few rows ahead pulled out her phone and started typing furiously. "I'm in aviation school," she explained to her seatmate. "There are only 4 women in my whole class. I'm sending them a message about what I just witnessed. They need to hear this." The flight attendants moved through the cabin, preparing for takeoff, but they too were touched by the atmosphere. One of them, who had been flying for 15 years, shared quietly with a passenger how she'd seen countless female pilots face similar situations, but never had she seen someone handle it with such grace and educational spirit. A small boy tugged on his father's sleeve, asking in a loud whisper, "Dad, can boys be pilots too?" The question made several nearby passengers chuckle, a beautiful reminder of how quickly perceptions can change when barriers are broken. An off-duty pilot, seated in coach, spoke up to those around him, explaining how the industry was slowly changing, but that moments like this were still too common. "What makes today special," he said, "is not just our captain's response, but how this entire plane full of strangers came together to support what's right." Near the middle of the plane, a group of business travelers who had been busy with laptops and phones were now engaged in a quiet but passionate discussion about diversity in their own workplace. "Maybe," one of them said, "we're not doing enough to make sure everyone gets a fair chance." The young girl with the airplane drawings had started sketching again, but this time she was drawing herself in the cockpit, wearing a captain's uniform. Her mother looked over her shoulder and smiled, knowing that today's experience would stay with her daughter forever. As the plane prepared for takeoff, there was a feeling of community that you rarely find among strangers on a flight. Different voices, different stories, but all coming together in support of one simple truth, that excellence knows no boundaries of gender or color. Through the cockpit door, the captain could hear snippets of these conversations. Each voice of support, each shared story, reminded her why she had chosen education over confrontation. Sometimes the biggest changes start with small moments of understanding, spreading from person to person like ripples on a pond. The flight had been smooth for the first hour when the weather radar picked up some unexpected turbulence ahead. Dark clouds loomed in the distance, their shapes familiar to her experienced eye. She'd seen worse, much worse, in her years of flying, but she knew this would be a perfect opportunity to demonstrate her expertise. "Ladies and gentlemen," she spoke into the intercom, her voice calm and reassuring, "we're approaching an area of turbulence. I'm going to adjust our altitude to find smoother air. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." As the plane entered the rougher air, she handled the controls with the precision that came from years of experience. Her movements were smooth, almost graceful, as she guided the massive aircraft through the bumpy patch. The first officer watched admiringly as she made tiny adjustments, finding pockets of smoother air that most pilots might have missed. In the cabin, the earlier skeptical passenger gripped his armrests tightly, but this time his tension came from the turbulence, not from doubts about his pilot. He watched through his window as the wings flexed naturally with each bump, remembering how she had explained this safety feature during their cockpit visit. Slight deviation to the right. She informed air traffic control, her voice steady as she guided the plane through another patch of rough air. The response from the controller was immediate and approving. They knew her reputation for finding the smoothest routes through tough weather. The flight attendants moved calmly through the cabin, reassuring nervous passengers. "Our captain's one of the best with turbulence," one of them told a worried mother with 2 small children. "Just watch how smooth she keeps it even in rough air." A retired pilot sitting in business class leaned over to his seatmate. "Watch this," he said with admiration. "See how she's using the weather radar to thread between those storm cells. That skill you only get from years of experience." She continued to make small course adjustments, each one calculated to maximize passenger comfort while maintaining their schedule. The plane responded to her touch like a well-trained dance partner, moving precisely where she guided it. "Flight attendants, you can resume service," she announced after successfully navigating through the worst of the turbulence. The smooth handling had impressed even the most nervous flyers. A quiet round of applause broke out in the cabin, not just for avoiding the bumps, but for the skill with which she'd done it. The first officer turned to her with respect in his eyes. "That was something else," he said. "I've flown this route dozens of times, but I've never seen anyone handle turbulence so smoothly." She smiled, remembering her own training days and the countless hours she'd spent perfecting these very maneuvers. Back in the cabin, conversations had started up again, but now they were different. Passengers weren't just talking about her handling of the earlier confrontation. They were discussing her obvious skill as a pilot. Professional expertise had trumped any lingering doubts about her capabilities. "Folks," she announced, her voice warm but professional, "we've cleared the turbulent area and should have smooth sailing for the rest of our flight to Dallas. Current temperature at our destination is 75 degrees with clear skies." A businessman who frequently flew this route turned to his seatmate. "I've been through this stretch of air dozens of times," he said, "but this was by far the smoothest crossing I've experienced." Others nearby nodded in agreement. The young girl who dreamed of being a pilot had been watching the whole thing through her window, her face pressed against the glass in fascination. She turned to her mother and whispered, "Did you feel how smooth that was? That's exactly how I want to fly when I grow up." Even the flight attendants, who flew this route regularly, were impressed. "You see that?" one whispered to a newer colleague. "That's why we always hope she's our captain. Pure skill, no drama, just excellence in action." In the cockpit, she continued monitoring their progress, making small adjustments as needed. Every detail was attended to, every instrument checked, every calculation double verified. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was simply about doing what she did best, being an exceptional pilot. As the plane descended toward Dallas, the city lights sparkled below like scattered diamonds. Her hands moved confidently over the controls, preparing for what would be one of her smoothest landings yet. The evening sky had turned a beautiful shade of orange, creating the perfect backdrop for their arrival. "Flight deck to cabin crew. Prepare for landing," she announced, her voice carrying the same steady confidence it had maintained throughout the flight. The first officer completed the landing checklist as they made their final approach. In the cabin, passengers were gathering their belongings, but something was different. There was a sense of anticipation, of waiting to see one final demonstration of skill from their captain. The elderly passenger who had caused the earlier scene sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, a thoughtful expression on his face. The landing gear descended with a gentle thud, and she guided the massive aircraft toward the runway with the precision of an artist. The ground grew closer, the runway lights creating a perfect path before them. This was her favorite part of any flight, the moment when all her years of training came together in one smooth motion. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're making our final approach into Dallas. Flight attendants, please be seated for landing." Her voice was calm and professional, but there was a hint of warmth in it that hadn't been there at the start of the flight. The touchdown was so gentle that some passengers didn't even realize they had landed until they felt the slight pressure of the brakes. A spontaneous round of applause broke out in the cabin, not the polite, obligatory kind often heard on flights, but genuine appreciation for exceptional skill. As the plane taxied to the gate, the elderly passenger turned to his seatmate, his voice thick with emotion. "I need to say something to her," he said. "I need to make this right." The woman next to him nodded encouragingly, understanding the importance of this moment. The captain's voice came over the intercom one last time. "Welcome to Dallas, where the local time is 7:45 p.m. On behalf of our entire crew, thank you for flying with us today. Please remain seated until we reach our gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." As passengers began to stand and gather their belongings, the elderly man made his way toward the front of the plane. Others noticed and created a path for him, sensing the significance of what was about to happen. The flight attendants, who had witnessed the entire day's events, watched with interest. He waited by the cockpit door as she emerged, completing her final checks. When she saw him, she stood straight and professional, ready for whatever might come next. But what happened surprised everyone watching. "Captain," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet cabin, "I owe you an apology. Not just for doubting your abilities, but for carrying prejudices that have no place in this world." His words were sincere, his eyes meeting hers directly. She listened quietly as he continued, "The way you handled both me and this flight. Well, it taught me something important today. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Around them, other passengers had stopped to witness this moment of transformation. The young girl with the airplane drawings had worked her way to the front with her mother. She stood watching, clutching her notebook, as living proof that moments like these could change the future. "Thank you," the captain replied simply, extending her hand. The elderly man shook it firmly, respect having replaced his earlier skepticism. "My granddaughter," he added softly, "the one who wants to be a pilot. I'm going to tell her about you when I get home." Other passengers began sharing words of appreciation as they deplaned. "Best flight I've ever had," said one. "Thank you for showing us what real professionalism looks like," said another. Each comment was a small victory, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever faced doubt or discrimination. The first officer, watching from the cockpit doorway, nodded in appreciation. This was more than just another flight. It was a lesson in how excellence, patience, and dignity could change hearts and minds, one person at a time. 3 weeks after that memorable flight, the story had taken on a life of its own. A passenger's social media post about the incident went viral, touching hearts and opening minds across the country. The captain's response to discrimination had become a powerful example of how to handle prejudice with grace and professionalism. Aviation schools started calling, asking her to speak to their students. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking had never been her goal. But then she remembered the young girl with the airplane drawings and knew she had to accept. Her first presentation was to a small class of 30 students, half of them young women from different backgrounds. "When I was your age," she told them, standing in front of a classroom filled with eager faces, "someone told me that people like me don't belong in the cockpit. But here's what I learned. The sky doesn't care what you look like. It only cares about how well you fly." The students hung on her every word as she shared stories from her journey. She told them about studying late into the night, about the instructors who believed in her, and about the ones who didn't. She spoke about her first solo flight, her hands gripping the controls, her heart racing with excitement. But it wasn't just speaking engagements. She started a mentorship program, connecting experienced pilots with young people who dreamed of flying but faced barriers because of their background or gender. The program began small, just 5 mentors and 5 students, but it grew quickly. One day, an envelope arrived at her home. Inside was a letter from the elderly passenger who had doubted her that day. "My granddaughter started flight lessons last week," he wrote. "Your example changed not just my mind, but her future. Thank you for showing us both what's possible." The airline took notice too. They asked her to help develop their diversity training program, recognizing that real change comes from people sharing real experiences. In the crew room, other pilots began sharing their own stories of overcoming prejudice, creating a more open and supportive environment. The young girl from the flight, still clutching her notebook of airplane drawings, got her wish. The captain invited her to sit in the cockpit of a parked plane, explaining every dial and switch. The girl's eyes sparkled with the same dreams that had once filled her own. "Remember," she told the girl, "every time someone says you can't, that's just their limitation, not yours." The girl nodded, running her hands over the controls, imagining her own future in the sky. News organizations began calling, wanting to tell her story. She agreed to a few interviews, but always shifted the focus from herself to the bigger picture. "This isn't about me," she would say. "It's about every person who's ever been told they don't belong somewhere. It's about changing the picture of what a pilot looks like. 6 months later, she stood in front of a graduating class of new pilots. Among them was a diverse group of faces, different genders, different backgrounds, all sharing the same dream of flight. As she looked at them, she remembered her own graduation, how alone she had felt. These new pilots would never have to feel that way. Her mentorship program had grown to include over 50 partnerships across the country. Other airlines began copying the model, creating their own programs to support diverse talent in aviation. What had started as one difficult moment on a flight to Dallas had grown into a movement for change. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the simplest. New passengers boarding her flights no longer did double takes when they saw her in the cockpit. Young girls would wave excitedly, and parents would point her out to their children, not as an exception, but as an example of what was possible. 1 year after that memorable flight, she received a photo from the elderly passenger. It showed his granddaughter taking her first flying lesson, her face glowing with determination. The note attached read simply, "You didn't just change my mind that day. You changed the future." And so her story continued to inspire, not as a tale of confrontation, but as an example of how excellence, dignity, and grace could open doors and change hearts, one flight at a time. The skies, she had proven, truly belonged to everyone brave enough to reach for them.